You know what they say about trusting family with your life savings? Well, I did exactly that. And I'm about to tell you why that was the biggest mistake I ever made. My name is Dorothy Mae Washington. I'm 67 years old, and 3 months ago I discovered that the person I loved most in this world had been systematically destroying my life for over 2 years. But here's what nobody tells you about betrayal. Sometimes the knife comes from the hand that once wiped your tears. I'm sitting here in my small apartment now, the same apartment I never thought I'd have to live in again, staring at the legal documents scattered across my kitchen table. The fluorescent light above flickers intermittently, casting dancing shadows on papers that tell the story of how I lost everything I worked 43 years to build. The coffee in my cup has gone cold hours ago, but I keep taking sips anyway, tasting the bitterness that somehow matches the weight in my chest. Every time I look at these documents, my hands shake slightly, not from age, but from the rage that still burns inside me when I think about how cleverly, how methodically, how lovingly I was betrayed. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, though at the time, it felt like a blessing. 2.5 years ago, I was living in the house I'd purchased with my late husband Marcus 31 years earlier. It was a beautiful 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood with a garden I'd spent decades perfecting, and a front porch where I'd watched my grandchildren take their first steps. The mortgage had been paid off for 15 years, and I had a comfortable nest egg of over $300,000 saved between my retirement accounts, life insurance payout, and careful investing. I wasn't rich, but I was secure, independent, and proud of what Marcus and I had accomplished together. After Marcus passed 4 years ago, I'd been managing just fine on my own. I had my routines, my church activities, my book club, and my weekly dinners with family. I thought I was living proof that a woman could age gracefully and maintain her independence. I took pride in paying my own bills, managing my own finances, and making my own decisions. That pride, I realize now, was exactly what made me such a perfect target. The first sign of trouble came disguised as concern. My daughter-in-law, Crystal Thompson Washington, started visiting more frequently. Crystal had married my eldest son, Jerome, 8 years earlier, and while our relationship had always been polite, it was never particularly warm. She was ambitious, well-educated, and had strong opinions about everything, from politics to proper table settings. I respected her intelligence, even if I sometimes felt she looked down on my simpler ways of doing things. But suddenly, Crystal was showing up at my door twice a week with homemade meals and genuine-seeming worry about my well-being. I remember the first time she mentioned my forgetfulness. I'd apparently told her the same story about my neighbor's cat twice in one conversation. I laughed it off, but I noticed the way she exchanged a meaningful glance with Jerome when she thought I wasn't looking. That glance should have been my first warning. But instead, I felt touched that they cared enough to worry about small things. Crystal began asking gentle questions about my daily routines. Was I remembering to take my medications? Had I been paying my bills on time? Was I feeling overwhelmed managing the big house all by myself? Her voice was always soft, caring, laced with what seemed like genuine concern. She'd sit at my kitchen table, the same table where I'm sitting now, and listen with such attention as I talked about my minor daily struggles, forgetting where I put my reading glasses, occasionally missing a phone call because I'd left my hearing aids upstairs, feeling tired after working in the garden. What I didn't realize was that Crystal was carefully cataloging every small confusion, every minor mistake, every moment of normal human forgetfulness that happens to everyone, regardless of age. She was building a case, creating a narrative, documenting what she would later present as evidence of my declining mental capacity. But at the time, I just felt grateful that someone in the family was paying such close attention to my needs. The conversations gradually shifted from casual concern to practical suggestions. Crystal started mentioning how difficult it must be to maintain such a large property at my age. She'd point out small maintenance issues I'd overlooked. A loose floorboard, a dripping faucet, some peeling paint on the back deck. She'd shake her head sympathetically and comment on how expensive home repairs had become. How challenging it must be to coordinate with contractors, how stressful it would be if something major went wrong when I was alone in the house. I found myself agreeing with her observations. The house did require constant upkeep, and I had been feeling less energetic about managing repairs and maintenance. When she suggested I might be happier in a smaller, more manageable living situation, it didn't sound like manipulation. It sounded like practical wisdom from someone who cared about my comfort and safety. Jerome started joining these conversations, adding his own gentle pressure. He'd mention how much he worried about me living alone, especially during the winter months when ice could make the front steps dangerous. He'd share stories he'd heard about elderly people who'd fallen in their homes and hadn't been found for days. He'd talk about the peace of mind the whole family would have if I were somewhere with more built-in security and support systems. Looking back now, I can see how carefully orchestrated these conversations were. Crystal and Jerome tag-teamed me with love and logic, presenting themselves as devoted family members whose only concern was my happiness and well-being. They never pressured me directly, never made demands or ultimatums. Instead, they planted seeds of doubt about my ability to live independently and watered them with examples of my supposed forgetfulness and stories of worst-case scenarios. The most insidious part was how they made me feel like the decision was entirely my own. When I finally brought up the possibility of selling the house and moving somewhere smaller, Crystal and Jerome acted surprised, as if the idea had never occurred to them. Crystal clasped her hands together and said she thought it was such a wise decision, that she was so proud of me for being mature enough to recognize when it was time to make a change. Jerome hugged me tight and told me how much he admired my courage and practical thinking. But here's where the manipulation became truly masterful. They convinced me that I needed help managing such a major life transition. Crystal pointed out that selling real estate, researching new living arrangements, and coordinating a move would be overwhelming for anyone, regardless of age. She offered to help me navigate the process, to research options, to handle the complicated paperwork and logistics. Jerome suggested that perhaps it would be wise to consolidate my financial accounts and simplify my money management while I was making so many other changes. I felt so lucky to have family members willing to take on such burdens for me. I thought I was being smart by accepting their help, practical by streamlining my affairs, responsible by making these changes while I was still mentally sharp enough to oversee the process. I had no idea I was signing my own financial death warrant. The house sold quickly for an excellent price. Crystal had found a real estate agent who specialized in properties in our neighborhood, and within 6 weeks we had multiple offers above asking price. I was amazed by Crystal's efficiency and grateful for her expertise. She handled all the negotiations, all the paperwork, all the scheduling for inspections and appraisals. All I had to do was sign documents and prepare for my move to the beautiful senior living community that Crystal had researched and Jerome had toured with me. The Sunset Gardens active adult community was everything they'd promised. Well-maintained grounds, friendly staff, organized activities, and a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment that would be perfect for my needs. The monthly fees were reasonable. The contract terms seemed fair, and I looked forward to the social opportunities and reduced responsibilities that community living would provide. I put down the required deposit and signed a 1-year lease, with the understanding that I could extend or terminate based on how well I adjusted to the new environment. What I didn't fully comprehend at the time was exactly how Crystal and Jerome had structured the financial arrangements for this transition. They convinced me that the wisest approach would be to consolidate all my assets into a single account that could be easily managed and accessed for my living expenses, healthcare needs, and other costs associated with aging. They suggested adding Jerome as a joint account holder, so that if anything happened to me, or if I became unable to manage my finances, he could step in immediately without the delays and complications of probate court. This seemed like sensible estate planning. Jerome was my eldest child, the most financially responsible of my 3 children, and the one who'd always shown the most interest in helping me with practical matters. Crystal had a background in business administration, so she could provide guidance and oversight to ensure everything was handled properly. I trusted them completely, loved them deeply, and felt grateful that they were willing to take on such responsibility for my well-being. The consolidation process took several weeks. Crystal arranged meetings with financial advisors, helped me close out multiple accounts, coordinated the sale of some investments, and organized the transfer of funds into our new joint account. She created spreadsheets showing my income sources, projected expenses, and long-term financial projections. Everything looked organized, professional, and carefully planned for my security and comfort. I remember feeling so relieved as we completed each step of the process. No more juggling multiple account statements, no more trying to remember different passwords and account numbers, no more worrying about missing payments or making mistakes with online banking. Crystal set up automatic payments for all my regular expenses, created a simple monthly budget that I could easily follow, and assured me that she'd monitor everything to make sure there were no problems or oversights. For the first few months at Sunset Gardens, everything seemed perfect. My monthly expenses were automatically deducted from the joint account. I had plenty of money for groceries, entertainment, and small luxuries, and I felt more relaxed than I had in years. Crystal continued to visit regularly, often bringing detailed reports on my financial status and updates on how well my investments were performing. She'd sit across from me in my new living room, pointing to numbers on her laptop screen, explaining market trends, and reassuring me that my money was growing steadily and safely. Jerome would stop by weekly, usually bringing flowers or a small gift, and we'd have long conversations about family news, community events, and his work projects. He seemed genuinely interested in my adjustment to community living, asked detailed questions about my new friends and activities, and expressed consistent pride in how well I was handling such a major life change. I felt loved, supported, and confident that I'd made the right decisions for my future. But sometimes, late at night in my new apartment, I'd lie in bed feeling a subtle uneasiness that I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't homesickness for my old house, and it wasn't dissatisfaction with my new living situation. It was something deeper, a nagging sense that something important was happening just outside my awareness, like hearing whispered conversations in the next room without being able to make out the actual words. I started paying closer attention to the financial reports Crystal shared with me. The numbers all looked good on the surface: steady income from my investments, reasonable monthly expenses, healthy account balances, but I began noticing small discrepancies that didn't quite make sense. There were occasional charges I didn't remember authorizing, investment changes I didn't recall discussing, and explanations that seemed overly complicated for what should have been simple transactions. When I asked Crystal about these details, she always had ready answers. The unfamiliar charges were for services that benefited me: insurance premiums, account maintenance fees, investment advisory costs that were deducted automatically. The investment changes were strategic moves she and Jerome had made to optimize my returns and minimize risk, based on market conditions and expert recommendations. Her explanations were always logical, delivered with confidence, and supported by official-looking documents that I couldn't fully understand, but that seemed to validate her claims. I wanted to trust her explanations, needed to believe that my finances were in capable hands, but the feeling of unease continued growing stronger. I started requesting copies of monthly statements for my own records, asking more detailed questions about specific transactions, and expressing interest in understanding my overall financial picture more completely. Crystal seemed slightly irritated by my increased curiosity, but she maintained her helpful, patient demeanor while providing the information I requested. That's when I began to notice the pattern that would eventually expose the entire scheme. Every month, there were transfers out of our joint account that Crystal explained as reinvestments, diversification moves, or payments to financial management services. The amounts were significant but not alarming, usually between $5,000 and $15,000, and they were always accompanied by official-looking documentation and reasonable-sounding explanations. But when I started adding up these monthly transfers, I realized that over the course of 18 months, more than $200,000 had been moved out of what was supposed to be my secure, easily accessible account. When I asked Crystal to show me where this money had been invested and how it was performing, she became evasive, defensive, and for the first time, openly annoyed with my questions. She told me I was worrying unnecessarily, that my constant questioning showed a lack of trust that hurt her feelings after everything she'd done to help me. She said my fixation on financial details was exactly the kind of stress and confusion she'd been trying to spare me from by handling these matters herself. She suggested that perhaps my concerns were a sign of the mental decline she'd been worried about, that my inability to understand complex financial concepts was making me paranoid and suspicious of people who were only trying to help me. For a moment, her words made me doubt my own perceptions. Was I being paranoid? Was my concern about missing money actually confusion about financial concepts I'd never fully understood? Was my growing suspicion of Crystal's explanations really evidence of mental decline rather than legitimate questions about my own money? But then I remembered who I was before this nightmare began. Dorothy Mae Washington, who'd managed her own finances for over 4 decades, who'd successfully navigated mortgage applications, insurance claims, investment decisions, and estate planning after Marcus died. Dorothy Mae Washington, who'd raised 3 children, run a household, held down 2 part-time jobs while Marcus worked full-time, and built a comfortable retirement through careful saving and smart financial choices. I wasn't a confused old woman who couldn't understand her own money. I was an experienced adult who was asking legitimate questions about unexplained financial transactions, and the fact that Crystal was responding to my questions with emotional manipulation rather than clear answers told me everything I needed to know about what was really happening to my life savings. That night, I called my youngest daughter, Patricia, who lived 3 states away. We'd always been close, and I knew she'd give me honest advice without judgment. When I explained my concerns about the missing money and Crystal's defensive reactions, Patricia was immediately alarmed. She asked detailed questions about the account setup, the financial consolidation process, and the ongoing management arrangements that I'd never fully explained to her or to my middle son, Robert. Patricia's response was swift and definitive. She said she was driving up to visit me that weekend, and she wanted to bring a friend who worked as a financial advisor to review my situation and help me understand exactly where my money was and who had access to it. She said she'd been worried about me making such major financial changes without input from all of her siblings, and she wished I'd consulted with her before adding Jerome as a joint account holder. Her words hit me like ice water. I realized that in my gratitude for Jerome and Crystal's help, I'd never discussed these major decisions with Patricia or Robert. I'd allowed Crystal to convince me that streamlining and simplification meant keeping the process within a small circle of people. But what I'd actually done was give 2 people complete control over my financial life, while cutting out the family members who might have asked harder questions or raised concerns about the arrangements. As I hung up the phone that night, I felt a cold certainty settling in my chest. I'd been played, manipulated, systematically robbed by people I'd trusted with my life. And tomorrow, I was going to start fighting back. But I had no idea just how deep this betrayal went, or how much more I was about to lose before I could even begin to recover what they'd stolen from me. Patricia arrived that Friday evening with her friend Michael Chen, a certified financial planner who specialized in elder financial abuse cases. I'll never forget the moment I opened my apartment door and saw the grim expression on Patricia's face. She hugged me tighter than she had in years, and I could feel the tension in her body as she whispered in my ear that everything was going to be okay, that we'd figure this out together. But even as she spoke those reassuring words, I heard the underlying fear in her voice that told me she was already expecting the worst. Michael was a soft-spoken man in his early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle manner that immediately put me at ease. He sat across from me at my small dining table, the same spot where Crystal had presented her monthly financial reports, and asked me to walk him through exactly how the account consolidation had been handled. As I described the process, I watched his expression grow increasingly serious, and I saw him exchanging meaningful looks with Patricia that made my stomach clench with dread. He asked to see all the documentation I had regarding the financial transfers, the account setup, and the ongoing management arrangements. I spread everything out on the table: monthly statements, investment summaries, transfer authorizations, and the various official-looking documents Crystal had provided over the past 2 years. Michael studied each paper carefully, taking notes on a yellow legal pad and occasionally asking me to clarify specific dates or explain my understanding of particular transactions. What he discovered made my worst fears seem optimistic by comparison. The joint account that was supposed to be securing my financial future contained less than $40,000. Over $260,000 had been systematically transferred out through a series of shell companies and fictitious investment vehicles that existed only on paper. The monthly reports Crystal had been showing me were completely fabricated, created on professional-looking letterhead, but bearing the names of companies that had never existed. Michael's voice was gentle but clear, as he explained that I'd been the victim of a sophisticated financial fraud, orchestrated by people who knew exactly how to exploit my trust and manipulate my desire to simplify my financial management. The transfers had been structured to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts, spread out over time to appear like legitimate investment activities, and documented with fake paperwork designed to reassure me that my money was being handled responsibly. The worst part was discovering that Jerome's name wasn't just on the account as a precautionary measure for emergencies. He'd been given complete signatory authority, which meant he could move money, close accounts, and make major financial decisions without my knowledge or consent. Crystal had convinced me this was standard estate planning practice, but Michael explained that legitimate joint accounts for elderly parents typically include built-in safeguards and notification requirements that were completely absent from my arrangement. As Michael continued reviewing the documents, his findings grew even more disturbing. The beautiful senior living community where I'd been so happy wasn't just expensive, it was being paid for with money that had been stolen from my other accounts before the consolidation was even complete. Crystal had been using my own savings to pay for my rent, utilities, and living expenses while simultaneously draining the consolidated account for her and Jerome's personal use. The scope of their deception was breathtaking. They'd created an entire fictional financial reality designed to keep me content and unsuspecting, while they systematically stole everything I'd worked my entire adult life to accumulate. Every monthly report, every reassuring conversation, every expression of concern for my well-being had been part of an elaborate performance designed to keep me compliant while they robbed me blind. Patricia was crying openly as Michael explained the full extent of what had been stolen from me. She kept apologizing for not being more involved, for not asking harder questions when I'd mentioned the major changes I was making. She blamed herself for living so far away, for being so busy with her own family that she hadn't paid closer attention to what was happening with mine. I held her hand across the table and told her this wasn't her fault, but inside, I was drowning in my own guilt for being so easily deceived. Michael asked if I wanted to confront Jerome and Crystal directly or if I preferred to involve law enforcement immediately. The decision felt impossible. These weren't strangers who'd targeted me. They were family members I'd loved and trusted for years. Jerome was my firstborn child, the baby I'd nursed through pneumonia when he was 18 months old, the little boy who'd brought me dandelions and called them flowers, the young man who'd walked me down the aisle at his own wedding because Marcus was too emotional to do it without breaking down. But as I sat there staring at the evidence of their betrayal spread across my dining table, I realized that the Jerome who would steal his mother's life savings wasn't the same person as the son I'd raised and loved. Somewhere along the way, he'd become someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of looking me in the eye while systematically destroying my financial security and independence. I decided to confront them first, partly because I needed to understand how they could have done this to me, and partly because some desperate part of me still hoped there might be an explanation that would make sense of the senseless. Michael advised against this approach, warning me that confronting them would give them time to hide assets, destroy evidence, or create additional legal complications. But I insisted that I needed to look them in the eye and ask them why they'd chosen to betray me so completely. Patricia called Jerome and asked him and Crystal to come to my apartment the next morning for a family meeting about my finances. She didn't explain what we'd discovered, just said that I had some concerns that needed to be addressed. Jerome agreed immediately, his voice warm and concerned as he asked if everything was okay, if there was anything urgent they needed to know about. His genuine-sounding worry made me feel sick, knowing that it was just another layer of the performance they'd been maintaining for over 2 years. That night, I barely slept. I kept running through memories of every conversation, every financial decision, every moment when I'd felt grateful for their help and support. I replayed Crystal's expressions of concern, Jerome's reassuring hugs, their patient explanations of complex financial matters that I now knew were complete fabrications. I thought about all the times I'd praised them to friends and neighbors, bragging about how lucky I was to have such caring, responsible family members looking out for me. The next morning, Jerome and Crystal arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, just as they had for every previous family meeting. Jerome brought fresh flowers, as he always did, and Crystal carried a leather portfolio that I now knew contained more fake documents designed to maintain their charade. They both hugged me warmly, asked about my week, and settled into their usual seats around my dining table with the comfortable familiarity of people who had nothing to hide. Patricia and Michael were waiting in my bedroom, ready to join us once I'd had a chance to ask my initial questions. I looked across the table at these two people I'd trusted with everything I had, and for a moment, I almost lost my nerve. Crystal smiled at me with what appeared to be genuine affection, and Jerome reached over to pat my hand the way he had when he was a little boy seeking comfort after a nightmare. But then I remembered the empty accounts, the fake investment reports, the months of carefully orchestrated lies, and I found the strength to speak. I told them that I'd been reviewing my financial situation with an outside advisor, and I'd discovered some discrepancies that I needed them to help me understand. I kept my voice calm and neutral, not wanting to alert them to how much I'd already learned about their scheme. Crystal's reaction was immediate and telling. Her smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by a flash of what looked like panic before she regained her composure. She launched into a familiar speech about how financial markets had been volatile lately, how some of my investments had been temporarily restructured to minimize risk, how the monthly reports might not reflect the most current status of various holdings. Jerome nodded along with her explanations, adding reassuring comments about how they'd been working hard to protect my interests during a challenging economic period. But I noticed subtle changes in their demeanor. Crystal spoke more quickly than usual, stumbling slightly over words she'd normally deliver with confidence, and Jerome avoided direct eye contact in a way that reminded me of when he was 12 years old and had broken my favorite vase while playing baseball in the house. I asked them to show me exactly where my money was currently invested, which accounts held which amounts, and how I could access my funds if I needed them for an emergency. Crystal shuffled through the papers in her portfolio, speaking rapidly about diversification strategies and market timing, but she couldn't produce any actual account statements or contact information for the investment firms she claimed were managing my money. That's when I called Patricia and Michael to join us. The moment Jerome and Crystal saw Michael's business card and realized he was a financial planner, their entire demeanor shifted. Crystal's face went pale, and Jerome's jaw tightened in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, caught lying about where he'd been on a Saturday night. Michael calmly explained what his review of my documents had revealed. He spoke in clear, simple terms about shell companies, fictitious investments, and unauthorized transfers, never raising his voice or making accusations, just presenting facts in a matter-of-fact tone that made the evidence impossible to deny or dismiss. Crystal tried to maintain her facade for about 30 seconds, insisting that Michael didn't understand the sophisticated investment strategies they'd been implementing on my behalf. She claimed that the missing money was temporarily held in private investment vehicles that wouldn't show up on standard account statements, that everything would be properly documented in the quarterly reports that hadn't been prepared yet. But Jerome broke first. He looked across the table at me with tears in his eyes and said the words that confirmed my worst nightmare. "Mama, I'm so sorry. We never meant for it to go this far. If you've been following this story and feeling the same shock and betrayal that I experienced, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear about the warning signs of financial abuse. Your engagement helps ensure that other families don't suffer the way mine has." The confession that followed was devastating in its scope and calculated cruelty. Jerome and Crystal had been planning this scheme for over 3 years, beginning long before Marcus died, when they'd started researching elder financial abuse techniques and identifying the most effective ways to manipulate elderly parents into surrendering control of their assets. They'd carefully studied my personality, my relationship patterns, and my financial habits to design their approach specifically for me. Crystal's sudden increase in visits and expressions of concern weren't spontaneous. They were the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign to undermine my confidence in my ability to live independently and manage my own affairs. Every conversation about my forgetfulness, every suggestion about downsizing, every offer to help with complex financial decisions had been part of a systematic effort to convince me that I needed their protection and guidance. They'd even coordinated with each other to ensure their stories remained consistent and their pressure remained subtle enough to avoid triggering my suspicions. The money they'd stolen hadn't gone toward investments or savings accounts for my benefit. Jerome had used it to pay off massive gambling debts he'd accumulated over several years of compulsive betting on sports, horses, and casino games. Crystal had used her share to fund a luxury lifestyle that included expensive vacations, designer clothing, and lease payments on a BMW that I'd never seen because they'd been careful to park it out of sight during their visits to my apartment. They'd spent over $200,000 of my life savings on gambling losses and personal luxuries while convincing me that my money was being carefully invested for my future security. Every time I'd expressed gratitude for their help, every time I'd praised their financial management skills to friends and neighbors, I'd been unknowingly celebrating the success of their theft. The most crushing revelation was learning that they'd never intended to stop. Jerome admitted that they'd been planning the next phase of their scheme, which would have involved convincing me to move to a less expensive living situation so they could steal the difference in housing costs, and eventually to sign over my remaining assets through a power of attorney arrangement that Crystal would have convinced me was necessary for proper estate planning. They'd been planning to rob me of everything I owned, leave me financially dependent on government assistance, and maintain their caring family member facade throughout the entire process. If I hadn't started asking questions about the missing money, they would have continued stealing until there was nothing left to take. As Jerome and Crystal confessed the details of their betrayal, I felt something inside me break that I knew would never heal completely. It wasn't just the money they'd stolen, devastating as that loss was. It was the destruction of every loving memory, every moment of gratitude, every feeling of safety and family support that I'd experienced over the past 2 years. Every hug had been a lie. Every expression of concern had been manipulation. Every reassurance about my financial security had been a cruel joke told at my expense. They'd turned my love for them into a weapon they'd used to destroy my life, and they'd done it with such skill and patience that I'd actually thanked them for the privilege of being robbed. The legal process that Michael initiated immediately was complex and emotionally brutal. Because Jerome was a joint account holder, proving theft required demonstrating that the money had been used for purposes I hadn't authorized and wouldn't have approved. The investigation required me to relive every detail of their deception, to examine every lie they'd told, to confront the full scope of my own gullibility and naivety. The district attorney's office was sympathetic but realistic about the challenges of prosecuting family financial abuse cases. Many victims are reluctant to testify against their own children, and defense attorneys often argue that the money was used for the elderly person's benefit or with their implicit consent. The emotional complexity of family relationships makes these cases difficult for juries to evaluate objectively, but I was determined to see justice done, not just for my own sake, but for other elderly people who might be targeted by similar schemes. I testified at every hearing, provided detailed documentation of every deception, and refused plea bargain offers that would have resulted in lighter sentences in exchange for partial restitution. The trial lasted 6 weeks and was covered by local media as an example of the growing problem of elder financial abuse. I had to sit in a courtroom and listen to defense attorneys argue that Jerome and Crystal had been trying to help me, that their management of my finances had been well-intentioned, even if it was poorly executed, that I was a vindictive old woman trying to punish family members for making honest mistakes. Every day of testimony was a fresh humiliation as the details of my deception were presented as evidence. I had to acknowledge publicly that I'd been foolish enough to trust people who were systematically robbing me, that I'd failed to protect myself from manipulation by my own family members, that I'd been so easily deceived that I'd actually expressed gratitude for being victimized. The media coverage was particularly painful because reporters focused on the sensational aspects of the family betrayal rather than the systematic techniques Jerome and Crystal had used to exploit my trust. Headlines described the case as a family feud over money or inheritance dispute turns ugly, completely missing the point that this wasn't a disagreement about family finances, but a calculated criminal enterprise designed to steal everything I owned. But the most devastating moment came when Jerome took the stand in his own defense. Looking directly at me, he testified that everything he'd done had been motivated by love and concern for my well-being. He claimed that he'd been worried about my mental decline, that he'd been trying to protect me from making poor financial decisions, that he'd used the money to pay for services and expenses that benefited me directly. He painted himself as a devoted son, struggling to care for a mother who was becoming increasingly confused and paranoid, someone who'd made some poor choices, but whose heart had always been in the right place. His testimony was polished, emotional, and completely convincing to anyone who hadn't lived through the reality of his systematic deception. Crystal's testimony was even more painful because she focused on our relationship and the trust I'd placed in her guidance. She described herself as a daughter-in-law who'd stepped up to help when she saw me struggling with complex financial decisions, someone who'd sacrificed her own time and energy to ensure my comfort and security. She admitted to making mistakes in managing my money, but insisted that every decision had been made with my best interests at heart. Listening to them transform their cruel betrayal into a story of family devotion and misguided good intentions was almost more painful than discovering the original theft. They were stealing from me again, this time taking my right to be acknowledged as the victim of deliberate criminal activity rather than the beneficiary of well-meaning but incompetent financial management. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on most of the major charges. Jerome was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution. Crystal received 2 years and was also held financially liable for the stolen funds. But the practical reality was that they'd already spent most of my money, and neither of them had sufficient assets to make meaningful restitution payments. The legal victory felt hollow when I realized that winning the case didn't mean recovering my stolen savings. Jerome and Crystal's combined assets totaled less than $30,000, and most of that was tied up in property and possessions that would take months or years to liquidate through the legal system. The gambling debts and luxury spending had consumed my life savings as completely as if it had been burned in a fire. I moved out of Sunset Gardens 6 months after the trial concluded. Not because I was dissatisfied with the community, but because I could no longer afford the monthly fees. The apartment I'm living in now costs less than half of what I was paying at the senior community, but it's in a neighborhood that makes me nervous and a building where I don't know any of my neighbors. The financial impact of their betrayal extends far beyond the money they directly stole. I lost the security deposit and advance payments I'd made at Sunset Gardens. I had to liquidate my remaining investments at unfavorable market prices to cover immediate living expenses. I'm now dependent on Social Security and a small pension that provide just enough income to cover basic necessities, with nothing left over for emergencies, healthcare expenses, or the small luxuries that make life comfortable. But the emotional devastation has been even more destructive than the financial losses. I haven't spoken to Jerome since his sentencing, and I don't know if I ever will. The son I raised and loved for 43 years feels dead to me, replaced by a stranger who was capable of destroying his own mother's life for gambling money and luxury items. Crystal has made several attempts to contact me, sending letters from prison that I return unopened and leaving voicemails that I delete without listening. Patricia tells me that Crystal's family has disowned her completely, that she's lost custody of her 2 young children, and that her own parents have refused to provide any support during her incarceration. I feel no satisfaction in knowing that Crystal's life has been destroyed by the consequences of her choices. Her children are innocent victims of her crimes, and they'll grow up knowing that their mother went to prison for stealing from their grandmother. The ripple effects of betrayal continue expanding, harming people who played no role in the original deception, but who must live with its consequences. The hardest part of each day is the constant awareness of how completely I was deceived. Every memory of the past 3 years is poisoned by the knowledge that nothing was real, that every interaction was part of an elaborate performance designed to rob me of everything I had. I find myself questioning every relationship, every conversation, every expression of care or concern from anyone in my life. Patricia has been wonderful, visiting as often as she can and calling every few days to check on me. But even with her, I sometimes catch myself analyzing her words and motivations, wondering if her concern is genuine or if she has her own agenda. The betrayal by Jerome and Crystal has left me unable to trust my own judgment about people's intentions, and that uncertainty colors every relationship I have. Robert, my middle son, has been supportive throughout the legal process, but our relationship remains strained by his guilt over not recognizing what his brother was doing, and his anger at me for being so easily manipulated. He's never said directly that he thinks I was foolish to trust Jerome and Crystal so completely, but I can see the judgment in his eyes when he looks at me. My grandchildren, Jerome's kids, are caught in an impossible situation. Their father is in prison for stealing from their grandmother. Their mother is bitter and defensive about the family's reaction to her husband's crimes, and they don't understand why family gatherings no longer include half the people they love. I see them occasionally, but the visits are awkward and painful for everyone involved. The broader family and social consequences have been almost as devastating as the financial and legal ones. Some friends and neighbors have been supportive, but others have distanced themselves from what they see as family drama. A few have made comments suggesting that I should have been more careful with my money, that I should have involved other family members in financial decisions, that I should have been more suspicious of Jerome and Crystal's motivations. Their victim-blaming attitude hurts deeply because it implies that being trusting and loving toward family members is a character flaw rather than a normal human response. I wasn't naive or foolish for believing that my son and daughter-in-law wanted to help me. I was acting like a mother and grandmother who loved her family and trusted them to love her back. But now I'm living with the consequences of that trust, and the isolation it has created feels almost as crushing as the financial devastation. I spend most of my days alone in this small apartment, afraid to form new relationships because I no longer trust my ability to recognize people's true intentions, unable to enjoy the relationships I still have because the betrayal has left me constantly suspicious and guarded. The woman I used to be, confident, independent, socially active, feels like a stranger to me now. That woman believed in the goodness of people, especially family members. She was proud of her ability to manage her own life and make her own decisions. She looked forward to each day and felt grateful for the love and support of her children and grandchildren. The woman I am now lives in fear and suspicion, questioning every kindness and analyzing every interaction for signs of manipulation or deception. I've lost not just my money and my independence, but my ability to trust, to love freely, and to believe that people are generally good. Jerome and Crystal stole more than my savings. They stole my faith in humanity and my sense of safety in the world. As I sit here tonight, 3 months after the trial ended, I'm still trying to figure out how to rebuild a life from the wreckage of their betrayal. The money is gone and will never be recovered. The relationships are destroyed and may never heal. The trust is shattered and may never be restored. But there's something else they couldn't steal from me, something I'm only beginning to recognize and reclaim. They couldn't steal my dignity, my intelligence, or my right to speak the truth about what happened to me. They couldn't steal my determination to survive their betrayal and find a way to create meaning and purpose from the devastation they caused. And most importantly, they couldn't steal my story. Tomorrow, I'm going to start telling other people exactly how this sophisticated financial abuse scheme worked, how 2 people I loved and trusted systematically destroyed my life while convincing me to be grateful for their help. I'm going to make sure that other elderly people recognize the warning signs that I missed, that other families understand how financial predators operate, and that other victims know they're not alone in their pain and confusion. Jerome and Crystal thought they were stealing my future when they took my money. But what they actually did was give me a new purpose, a new mission, and a new reason to fight back against the people who prey on elderly trust and vulnerability. And that fight is just beginning. 6 months after Jerome was sentenced to prison, I received a letter that would change everything about how I understood my own story. It came from a woman named Margaret Torres, who lived 2 states away and had seen the news coverage of my case. She wrote to tell me that she'd experienced almost identical financial abuse from her own daughter and son-in-law, using nearly the same techniques and manipulative strategies that Jerome and Crystal had employed against me. I sat at my kitchen table reading her letter with trembling hands, recognizing detail after detail of my own experience in her words. The gradual expressions of concern about her ability to live independently, the helpful offers to consolidate and simplify her financial management, the fake investment reports and shell company transfers, the systematic theft disguised as caring family assistance. Margaret had lost over $400,000 before discovering the scheme, and like me, she'd recovered almost nothing despite successful criminal prosecutions. But what struck me most powerfully about Margaret's letter was her description of the isolation and shame she'd felt after the betrayal was exposed. She wrote about questioning every relationship, analyzing every kindness for hidden motives, feeling like a fool for trusting people who'd systematically destroyed her life while claiming to love her. She described the exact emotional devastation that I'd been living with. The way the theft of money had been accompanied by the theft of her ability to trust her own judgment about people's character and intentions. Margaret had found my story through a support group for elder financial abuse victims that met monthly in her city. She encouraged me to look for similar resources in my area, and she included contact information for a national organization that provided education, advocacy, and support services for people who'd been targeted by family financial predators. For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized that I wasn't alone in my experience, that there were other people who understood exactly what I'd been through and how it had affected every aspect of my life. The shame and self-blame that had been eating away at me for months began to shift as I understood that my victimization hadn't been the result of personal weakness or stupidity, but rather the predictable outcome of sophisticated manipulation techniques used by criminals who specialize in exploiting elderly trust and love. I called the national organization that Margaret had recommended and spoke with a counselor named David Rodriguez, who'd been working with elder abuse victims for over 15 years. David explained that family financial abuse was one of the fastest growing crimes in the country, affecting millions of elderly Americans each year and causing billions of dollars in losses that are rarely recovered through the legal system. He told me that the techniques Jerome and Crystal had used against me were textbook examples of how these schemes typically operate: the gradual undermining of confidence in independent living abilities, the offers of help that slowly expand into complete financial control, the fake documentation designed to maintain victim compliance, the exploitation of family love and trust to prevent victims from seeking outside verification or assistance. David invited me to speak at a workshop his organization was hosting for financial professionals, law enforcement officers, and healthcare workers about recognizing and responding to elder financial abuse. He said that survivor stories were the most powerful educational tool available, that hearing directly from victims helped people understand both the sophistication of these schemes and the devastating impact they have on families. The idea of speaking publicly about my experience terrified me. I'd spent months feeling ashamed of being deceived, embarrassed about my failure to recognize obvious warning signs, humiliated by the public nature of the trial and media coverage. The thought of standing in front of strangers and describing the details of how I'd been manipulated and robbed felt like exposing myself to additional judgment and criticism. But David helped me understand that my shame was exactly what criminals like Jerome and Crystal counted on to keep their victims silent and isolated. Elder financial abuse thrives in secrecy, hidden behind family loyalty and victim embarrassment. By refusing to speak about what had happened to me, I was inadvertently protecting other predators who were using the same techniques against other vulnerable elderly people. I agreed to participate in the workshop, and preparing for that presentation became the beginning of my recovery in ways I never could have anticipated. As I organized my thoughts and experiences into a coherent narrative, I began to see patterns and techniques that I hadn't recognized while I was living through them. I understood for the first time how sophisticated and calculated Jerome and Crystal's approach had been, how their manipulation had been designed specifically to exploit my personality, my relationships, and my desires for family connection and simplified living. The workshop was held in a hotel conference room filled with about 60 professionals who worked with elderly clients in various capacities. I stood at a podium, looking out at faces that were attentive, respectful, and genuinely interested in understanding how to better protect their clients and patients from similar victimization. For the first time in over a year, I felt like an expert rather than a victim, someone whose experience had value and could help prevent others from suffering similar devastation. As I told my story, I watched people taking notes, nodding in recognition, asking thoughtful questions about specific techniques and warning signs. Several attendees approached me after the presentation to share their own encounters with suspected family financial abuse cases, seeking advice about how to intervene effectively and connect victims with appropriate resources. The response to my presentation was so positive that David invited me to speak at additional workshops and conferences throughout the region. Within 6 months, I was traveling regularly to share my story with diverse audiences: senior center groups, bank employees, healthcare workers, law enforcement officers, and other elder abuse survivors. Each speaking engagement taught me something new about my own experience and helped me develop a deeper understanding of how family financial abuse operates as a systematic crime rather than isolated incidents of family greed or dysfunction. I learned that there are established patterns, predictable techniques, and identifiable warning signs that can help potential victims recognize and avoid these schemes before significant damage is done. But more importantly, I discovered that sharing my story was healing me in ways I hadn't expected. Every time I spoke about what Jerome and Crystal had done to me, I reclaimed a little more of my power and dignity. Every question from audience members helped me see my experience from new perspectives. Every conversation with other survivors reminded me that I wasn't defined by my victimization, but rather by my survival and my determination to prevent others from suffering similar betrayals. The speaking engagements also connected me with legal professionals who were working on systemic reforms to better protect elderly people from financial exploitation. I testified at state legislative hearings about proposed laws that would require additional safeguards for financial institutions serving elderly clients, mandate reporting of suspected elder abuse by healthcare and social service workers, and establish specialized prosecution units for financial crimes against older adults. Through this advocacy work, I met other survivors who'd become activists and educators, people who'd transformed their own painful experiences into powerful tools for social change and victim protection. I joined the board of directors for a regional elder rights organization and helped develop educational materials and training programs for professionals who work with elderly clients. One of the most meaningful projects I became involved with was a peer support program that connected recent victims of elder financial abuse with survivors who'd been through the recovery process. I was paired with 3 women who'd been targeted by different types of family financial schemes, and helping them navigate the legal, emotional, and practical challenges of recovery became one of the most rewarding experiences of my later life. Sarah Martinez had been victimized by her grandson, who'd convinced her to take out a reverse mortgage on her fully paid home and then systematically stolen the proceeds through fake investment schemes. Linda Chen's son-in-law had gained power of attorney during a brief hospitalization and liquidated her entire retirement portfolio while she was recovering from surgery. Rosa Williams discovered that her live-in daughter had been forging her signature on checks and credit card applications for over 3 years. Working with these women taught me that while the specific techniques varied, the emotional impact was remarkably consistent across different types of family financial abuse. We all struggled with shame, self-blame, and the devastating loss of trust in our own judgment. We all dealt with complex grief over the destruction of family relationships and the loss of financial security. We all faced the challenge of rebuilding our lives and identities after experiencing profound betrayal by people we'd loved unconditionally. But we also all discovered strengths and capabilities we hadn't known we possessed. Sarah became a fierce advocate for reverse mortgage reform and consumer protection. Linda developed expertise in financial fraud investigation that she used to help other victims recover stolen assets. Rosa started a support group for Spanish-speaking elder abuse survivors in her community. Watching these women transform their pain into purpose inspired me to expand my own advocacy work. I began writing articles for seniors publications about financial safety and family relationship boundaries. I developed a workshop curriculum specifically for elderly people about recognizing manipulation techniques and protecting assets from family predators. I started a blog where I shared detailed information about different types of elder financial abuse and connected victims with appropriate resources and support services. The blog became surprisingly popular, attracting readers from across the country who shared their own experiences and sought advice about suspicious family financial situations. I realized that there were thousands of elderly people dealing with boundary violations, manipulation attempts, and outright theft by family members, but most felt too ashamed or confused to seek help or report criminal activity. Through the blog comments and private messages, I heard from people in every stage of potential victimization. adult children who were worried about elderly parents being manipulated by siblings or caregivers, elderly people who had nagging concerns about family members' financial requests but weren't sure if they were being overly suspicious, recent victims who were struggling with whether to report family crimes or pursue legal action. Each conversation reinforced my understanding that family financial abuse thrives on isolation, secrecy, and victim shame. The more people talked openly about these experiences, the more likely potential victims were to recognize warning signs and seek help before suffering devastating losses. I also began working with financial institutions to develop better detection and prevention protocols for elder financial abuse. Banks and investment firms were increasingly recognizing their role in protecting elderly clients from exploitation, but many employees lacked training in recognizing subtle manipulation techniques or felt uncertain about how to intervene without violating client privacy or autonomy. I helped design training programs that taught bank employees how to recognize red flags like sudden changes in financial patterns, unusual account activity involving family members, and signs that elderly clients might be under pressure or coercion. These programs emphasize that protection efforts should focus on providing information and resources rather than restricting client autonomy, helping elderly people make informed decisions about their financial relationships and transactions. One of the most powerful aspects of this institutional work was seeing how simple interventions could prevent major losses. A bank teller who asked thoughtful questions about an unusual large withdrawal. A financial advisor who noticed discrepancies in client statements about family involvement. A healthcare worker who recognized signs of financial stress in an elderly patient. These small acts of professional awareness and intervention had the potential to save people from devastating victimization. 3 years after Jerome was sentenced, I received an unexpected phone call from the prison chaplain. Jerome had been participating in a program for incarcerated individuals dealing with addiction and family issues, and he'd expressed interest in making amends to people he'd harmed through his gambling and criminal behavior. The chaplain asked if I would be willing to meet with Jerome as part of his recovery process. My first instinct was to refuse immediately. I'd built a new life, focused on helping others and advocating for systemic change, and I had no interest in reopening emotional wounds or providing Jerome with an opportunity to manipulate me further. The anger and pain I'd felt during the trial had evolved into something more like indifference. Jerome simply didn't matter to me anymore, in any personal sense. But after discussing the request with Patricia and my support group friends, I decided that meeting with Jerome might provide closure for both of us and potentially offer insights that could help my advocacy work. I agreed to a single meeting at the prison, with clear boundaries about what I was and wasn't willing to discuss. The meeting took place in a small conference room with the chaplain present as a mediator. Jerome looked older than his 45 years, thinner and grayer than he'd been at sentencing, but his eyes held a clarity and remorse that seemed genuinely different from the defensive manipulation I'd seen during the trial. He began by acknowledging the full scope of what he'd done to me. Not just the financial theft, but the betrayal of trust, the destruction of family relationships, and the devastating impact on my sense of security and independence. He didn't offer excuses about gambling addiction or financial pressures, didn't minimize the calculated nature of the scheme he and Crystal had implemented, didn't ask for forgiveness or understanding. Instead, Jerome talked about the therapy and education programs he'd been participating in, his growing understanding of how his addictive behaviors had escalated into criminal exploitation of people he claimed to love, and his commitment to making whatever amends were possible while accepting that some relationships could never be repaired. He told me that he'd been following news coverage of my advocacy work through articles and blog posts that other inmates had shared with him. He said he was proud of how I'd transformed my experience into something that helped other people, and he hoped that his crimes hadn't destroyed my ability to find meaning and purpose in the aftermath of his betrayal. The conversation lasted about an hour, and while it didn't heal the fundamental damage Jerome had caused, it did provide a sense of completion that I hadn't expected to find. Seeing him take full responsibility for his choices without deflecting blame or seeking sympathy helped me understand that the Jerome who'd raised him was gone forever, replaced by someone who was genuinely remorseful but irreversibly changed by his own criminal choices. I left the prison that day feeling lighter somehow, Not because I'd forgiven Jerome or restored any form of relationship with him, but because I'd confirmed that my recovery and new life weren't dependent on his acknowledgement or remorse. I'd built something meaningful and powerful from the wreckage he'd created, and that achievement belonged entirely to me, regardless of what he thought or felt about it. Crystal was released from prison 8 months after my meeting with Jerome, and she immediately began attempting to contact me through letters, phone calls, and messages delivered through mutual acquaintances. Her communications were filled with apologies, explanations about her own therapy and recovery work, and requests for some form of reconciliation or forgiveness. I didn't respond to any of her attempts at contact. Unlike Jerome, Crystal had never fully acknowledged the calculated nature of her manipulation, or taken complete responsibility for the sophisticated deception she'd orchestrated. Her letters still contained subtle suggestions that she'd been influenced by Jerome's gambling addiction, that she'd been trying to help me even if her methods were misguided, that our previous relationship had contained genuine affection despite her criminal exploitation of my trust. I'd learned enough about manipulation techniques through my advocacy work to recognize that Crystal's post-prison communications were just another form of manipulation, designed to ease her own guilt and potentially restore some form of access to my life and resources. I blocked her phone number, returned her letters unopened, and made it clear to family members and friends that I had no interest in any form of contact with her. The finality of that decision was liberating in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time since discovering their betrayal, I felt completely free from any obligation to consider Jerome and Crystal's feelings, needs, or perspectives. They'd forfeited any claim to my emotional energy or attention when they'd chosen to systematically rob and deceive me, and I no longer had to waste time or mental space on their attempts at reconciliation or redemption. Now, 5 years after that terrible night when I discovered them together in what I thought was an empty room, I'm living a life I never could have imagined. I have a small but comfortable apartment in a senior community that specializes in affordable housing for older adults. I have enough income from Social Security, my pension, and small speaking fees to cover my basic needs and even afford occasional luxuries. More importantly, I have a sense of purpose and community that I'd never experienced before my victimization. The advocacy work that grew out of my trauma has become the most meaningful and satisfying work of my entire life. I've helped develop legislation that's prevented thousands of elderly people from suffering similar financial abuse. I've trained hundreds of professionals to recognize and respond appropriately to elder exploitation. I've provided support and guidance to dozens of survivors who were struggling to rebuild their lives after family betrayal. The relationships I've built through this work are deeper and more authentic than many of the family connections I'd previously considered central to my identity. The people I work with now know me as someone who survived devastating betrayal and transformed that experience into powerful advocacy and service to others. They see my intelligence, my resilience, my expertise, and my compassion rather than viewing me as a victim who was foolish enough to trust criminal family members. I still think about Jerome sometimes, wondering how he's adjusting to prison life and whether his apparent remorse was genuine or just another form of manipulation. I occasionally see social media posts from his children, my grandchildren, who are now teenagers dealing with the ongoing stigma and complications of having a father in prison for financial crimes against their grandmother. But those thoughts no longer cause me pain or anger. Jerome and Crystal are part of my past, significant only because their betrayal led me to discover strengths and purposes I never would have found otherwise. They intended to destroy my life, but what they actually did was force me to rebuild it in ways that turned out to be far more meaningful and fulfilling than anything I'd experienced before. The trust issues that seemed so devastating in the immediate aftermath of their betrayal have largely resolved as I've learned to distinguish between healthy caution and paralyzing suspicion. I've developed new friendships based on shared interests and mutual respect, rather than family obligation or historical connection. I've learned to trust my instincts about people's character while maintaining appropriate boundaries around financial and personal information. Most importantly, I've discovered that being victimized by people I loved doesn't define me or limit my capacity for future relationships and experiences. I'm not a bitter old woman who can't trust anyone. I'm a strong, intelligent, experienced woman who's learned to recognize manipulation and protect herself from exploitation while remaining open to genuine connection and affection. If you're someone who's experienced betrayal by people you trusted, whether it's financial abuse or any other form of exploitation, please know that your story doesn't end with their betrayal. The pain and devastation you're feeling right now are real and valid, but they're not permanent. You have the strength to survive, to recover, and to create something meaningful from even the most devastating experiences. And if you're watching this video because you're concerned about an elderly person in your life who might be experiencing financial abuse, please don't ignore those concerns. Trust your instincts, ask direct questions, offer support and resources, and remember that the shame and isolation victims feel often prevent them from seeking help on their own. Financial abuse thrives in secrecy and silence. The more we talk openly about these experiences, share information about how these schemes operate, and support survivors in their recovery, the harder it becomes for predators to find and exploit vulnerable targets. I'm 72 years old now, and while I'll never recover the money that Jerome and Crystal stole from me, I've built a life that's richer and more purposeful than anything I could have imagined when I was living in my paid-off house with my substantial savings account. They took my financial security, but they couldn't take my intelligence, my resilience, or my determination to create meaning from adversity. Every day I wake up knowing that I have work to do, people to help, and purposes to fulfill that matter far more than the bank balances and investment portfolios I once thought defined my security and success. The woman I've become through surviving their betrayal is stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than the woman I was before they entered my life. That's the real victory in this story, not legal justice or financial recovery, but the discovery that we're capable of surviving and thriving even when the people we love most choose to destroy everything we've built. Jerome and Crystal thought they were stealing my future when they took my money. But what they actually did was force me to discover a future far more meaningful than anything I'd previously imagined. And that's a future they can never touch, no matter what they took from my past. Thank you for listening to my story, for sharing it with others who might need to hear it, and for being part of a community that refuses to let elder abuse happen in silence and isolation. Together, we can protect each other, support survivors, and ensure that predators like Jerome and Crystal find it much harder to exploit the trust and love that should be the foundation of family relationships. Your support and engagement with stories like mine help save lives and prevent devastating losses for countless elderly people and their families. Please continue to share, to comment, to ask questions, and to stay connected as we work together to create a world where growing older doesn't make you a target for exploitation by the people who should love and protect you most. My name is Dorothy Mae Washington, and I'm not just a survivor. I'm a warrior in the fight against elder financial abuse. And this fight is far from over.